Hello, thanks for watching and welcome back to the Saving Sally channel. Today we are changing out the alternator. So if you find yourself trying to change out an alternator in a 3rd gen F body, this is probably going to be a pretty good guide for you. I say probably because mileage may vary. In my instance, my alternator was on the driver's side. I know the alternator can be on the other side for different types of engines, and there may even be different types of alternators for different types of engines, but they should all be fairly similar. So with that out of the way, let's get right into it. First things first, I gotta tell you, if you have the Delco 2 audio system, that was a factory included audio system in your car, there's an anti-theft system that'll need to be disabled before you disconnect the negative terminal. That probably doesn't apply to you. Those systems were pretty rare to begin with, but just know that it is a possibility that you have this system, and if you do need to disable the anti-theft system before disconnecting the negative terminal. For me, there was no need to remove the intake tube, but again, mileage may vary. But the belt tensioner in my car was going to be able to be loosened with a 1/2 inch drive on either a breaker bar or a pretty good size ratchet. And once I had popped the ratchet into the belt tensioner, I was able to just move it just enough to allow me to slip the belt off of the alternator pulley. And when I first removed the belt and let the tensioner go back to its resting position, it actually pushed the ratchet pretty firmly against the intake tube. So what I did is I went ahead and reapplied the belt back onto the pulley and set the ratchet to a more vertical starting position so that then when I pushed it back, it didn't rest back onto the intake tube with any pressure. Now with the belt out of the way, over to the back side of the alternator, the plug that ties the alternator to the car's wiring harness is held in place by a little latch. Simply lift this latch up and pull the plug out and it should come right off. So next there's a 10mm bolt that passes through a mounting bracket on the backhand side. You're going to want to back that out and set that somewhere for safekeeping. And back up front there is a T40 Torx bolt up at the top, and I'm pretty sure it was a T50 down below. I do know it was not the same size. Let me know in the comments if you know which one it is. I just can't remember. Be sure to note here that the much longer bolt does go down below. With these bolts out of the way, just a little gentle pry with a large screwdriver or maybe a pry bar on the bottom of the alternator should break it loose if it happened to have become seized over the years. Just don't yank it out of the car yet because there is still a wire attached. And somehow I ended up losing the footage of me actually disconnecting this wire. It's pretty straightforward. It's just a bolt that sticks up with the wire through a little ring on the bolt and then a nut on the top. Just back off the nut and the wire pulls off. I can't explain to you where that footage is gone. It was just gone. And now in with the new alternator. You may notice on this alternator there is a slightly smaller pulley than the alternator that I pulled off the car. Keep that in mind. That's going to become an issue a little bit later on, but for now, let us proceed. You're going to want to line it up so that you can get the upper Torx bolt just started and maybe a handful of threads in. You don't want to run this down tight. You're going to need to be able to pivot the alternator to get it to line up with the lower Torx bolt. The lower Torx bolt with this particular replacement alternator gave me just a terrible time. It came with a sleeve inside of that hole for the alternator. It's possibly for use with other vehicles. I ended up pulling that out and getting rid of it. It just would not pass through the sleeve, but again, your mileage may vary. With that sleeve out of the way, the lower Torx bolt dropped right into place, and I went ahead and tightened it most of the way down without actually making it tight. I still needed to be able to move the alternator to line up the 3rd and final hole, which was the bolt that we took out of the back earlier that had been a 10mm bolt. Once that bolt was in place, I did go ahead and tighten it down, and then I went back up front and I tightened the remaining 2 Torx bolts. I don't have any of the torque specs for this. I just couldn't find any, and they're probably out there somewhere. Even in the manuals, they weren't included in terms of like a Chilton or a Haynes manual. So if you have those torque specifications, if there are any, please let me know down in the comments, and I'd like to get those added to the description. I didn't have any anti-seize on the day that I had set aside to do filming. I had a very narrow window that I could film, so I went ahead and did this without anti-seize. I did go back the next day and pull each bolt out individually, put anti-seize on them and put them back, and one of the bolts had already begun to kind of grab into the aluminum. So my advice is to you is I would not do this job without some anti-seize on hand. And now we need to reconnect the electrical connection that runs directly to the battery. Now the new replacement alternator had a slightly different setup than the outgoing alternator. In this case I had what amounts to a tab or an ear that sticks out that had a bolt and nut that passed through it and through the ring of that wire. It was pretty straightforward, just threaded it back down and tightened it down. And here I'm putting the cap back on. Next, we're going to go back to the plug that was on top of the alternator. Now, my alternator came with a cap to cover that plug. Yours may or may not have it. It came off the same way that the plug would come off of the car. You just lift the locking tab and the cap lifted right off. Once that was out of the way, you plug the wiring harness right back into the alternator, and all we have left to do now is the belt. And here's the first place that I really began to run into some trouble. If you remember earlier in the video when I pointed out that the pulley was slightly smaller on the new alternator, well, it actually was small enough to cause the belt to be out of spec with the tensioner, so much in fact that I could actually spin the alternator freely by hand. That just wasn't going to work, and so I had to go to the parts store and buy a new belt. I ended up having to get a 92 1/8 inch belt. There's probably a bunch of different varieties of this belt, but this is the part number that I went with, and it worked out really well. The thing to look for is on your tensioner, there are a series of notches and a spacer or a gap there that shows you need to be in as close to the center of this space as possible. Once I got the new belt on and ran the car for a few minutes, it was close enough to the center line to make me happy, so I just left it as is. And that kind of brings me to something that, I don't know, caught me a little bit off guard. I know that when I went to buy this alternator, there was a big step in the purchase process. It was like, oh wait, let's make sure that this alternator actually fits your car, and it asked a bunch of information, engine type and so on. During the whole process, I thought, well, we're making sure we're getting an exact fit, but in reality, they kind of didn't tell me about the belt problem. Just in my head, I would feel like that if we went through the trouble to make sure that it fits your car, and the system is smart enough to know whether or not it will fit, there should be some kind of red flag and say, hey, you might want to purchase a new belt with it. But I didn't get that. It wasn't the end of the world. The auto parts store was just a few minutes down the road. Now, the reason that pulley was slightly smaller on the new alternator is because the old alternator, the one that's included from the factory as well, is a 105 amp alternator, and the replacement that I put on there was 140 amp. Now, for most applications, 105 amps is fine. Even if you were going to go with a small sound system of some sort, you should still have no issues with a 105 amp alternator. For me, it came down to the possibility of that I am going to be doing an additional sound system. There were possibly some other things coming down the road too. I'm not decided yet, so I'm not going to give away too much on that. That may pull some more power. But one thing for certain is the cost difference between a factory replacement and this one that was black and looked nicer was not that much difference in the money, not including the belt change out, of course. So I did go ahead and buy it. So with the new belt in place, the tensioner right on the money, the alternator looked really good in the engine bay, and it's going to look even better with the new engine that's going to be coming in soon. So if you don't want to miss that engine swap, if you haven't done so already, I'm asking for a subscribe and maybe ring the notification bell so that you know the next time that I upload a video. That engine swap is planned for sometime this winter or fall. It's not something I can do in the summer months because my line of work is highly seasonal and my busy time is in the summer. If you want to use the same alternator that I used, I will include what it was in the description, so be sure and check that out. If you have any questions, comments, gripes, complaints, or suggestions, please drop those in the comments as well. So until next time, this is Jason, and this has been Saving Sally.